wrote, "The wind here feels honest," and hoped her mother would understand. Yet the more they wrote, the heavier the guilt became. Each sentence felt like a confession. To speak well of their captives was to betray their nation. To condemn them falsely was to betray themselves. They were trapped in the narrow space between loyalty and truth, and neither offered comfort. When Walt passed through the mess hall collecting finished letters, his usual easy smile faltered at the sight of so many tear-streaked faces. He hesitated, tipping his hat in quiet respect before leaving the room. That night, Aiko could not sleep. The ranch was still, the cattle murmuring softly in their pens. She lay on her bunk, clutching the letter she had written but not handed in. The words inside it seemed to pulse with heat as though they could burn through the paper. She thought of her mother reading it, how she might imagine cruelty, filth, starvation. To tell her otherwise would be unthinkable. And yet Aiko realized to deny the truth would erase something fragile that had been born within her. The belief that compassion could survive even in war. By morning, some of the women tore up their letters, others left them unfinished. Only a few were handed in, sealed with trembling hands and uncertain hope. Whether they ever reached Japan, no one knew. The censors would read them, strip away any detail that contradicted propaganda, perhaps discard them entirely. The rest would be lost to time like so many confessions never spoken aloud. As days turned into weeks, the letters became ghosts, unwritten, unread, but deeply felt. The women carried them inside their hearts, folded like fragile paper cranes. The moral dissonance gnawed at them. How could enemies show such decency when their own leaders had condemned them to die rather than surrender? The contradiction grew unbearable. It twisted their pride, hollowed their certainty, and left them wondering whether compassion too could wound. Walt once said, "Out here, a man's kindness can be sharper than a knife." At the time, Aiko hadn't understood. Now she did. Kindness stripped away hatred, left nothing to cling to but the raw ache of humanity. It was easier to endure cruelty. It kept the heart armored. Compassion demanded surrender, and that she realized was the hardest captivity of all. In the end, she slipped her unfinished letter beneath her pillow, unable to destroy it. It was both confession and proof. Proof that even in war, gentleness could be dangerous. Proof that mercy once received could never be forgot. And though no one would ever read her words, she knew they carried a truth deeper than victory or defeat. That sometimes the greatest weapon wasn't a gun or a whip but a simple act of care. The next morning the air smelled of dust and sunlight. Aiko rose before the bell, her body still aching from the day before but her spirit steadier somehow. The cowboys were already in the yard saddling horses, their movements slow and deliberate. Walt stood beside one, his hat low against the glare, a coil of rope in his hands. When he saw her watching from the barracks door, he gave a slight nod and motioned her over. "Time you learned the ropes," he said, the corners of his mouth twitching. She didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Half challenge, half invitation. That morning marked the beginning of their lessons. The women, once laborers and captives, were now being taught the trades of the plains: how to tie a rope that would not slip, how to mend a fence so tight the wind couldn't whisper through it. The work demanded precision, patience, and balance. The same virtues they had once been told were feminine weaknesses, but under the unforgiving sun those qualities became strength. Aiko's hands, once soft and unsteady, hardened with calluses. The rhythm of labor turned her muscles lean, her stance firmer. She found herself no longer counting the hours until rest. Instead, she measured her days by the quiet victories of skill mastered and fear overcome. Walt and the others never mocked their clumsiness. When a knot came loose or a fence post splintered, they simply showed the motion again, slower this time, until the women could mirror it. They didn't lecture, they demonstrated. Their teaching was wordless but clear. Precision was respect. Effort was honor, and the women who had once bowed under commands barked like gunfire began to find freedom in instruction that demanded not obedience but competence. The horses were the hardest lesson. To the Japanese women, horses were creatures of power and danger, symbols of foreignness itself. When Walt let out a chestnut mare one afternoon and motioned for Aiko to approach, her hands trembled. The animal's breath puffed against her arm, warm and steady. "She's gentle," Walt murmured, though she caught only the tone, not the words. Slowly she reached out and touched the horse's neck. Beneath the glossy coat she felt the thrum of life, strong, patient, untamed. That day she did not ride, she simply stood beside the mare until her fear quieted into awe. Days later Walt called her again. This time he showed her how to mount. "Left foot first," he said, demonstrating with exaggerated care. She tried, failed, and nearly tumbled backward, earning a ripple of laughter from the men nearby. But it wasn't cruel laughter. It was the laughter of shared effort, of learning together. She tried again and again. On the fourth attempt she found her balance. Sitting tall in the saddle, she felt the animal move beneath her, a living rhythm that demanded trust. Her spine straightened, her shoulders squared. For the first time since her capture, she felt taller than her fear. Walt looked up, tipped his hat, and said softly, "There you go." From then on, the yard echoed with sounds once unimaginable in a prison camp. Laughter, teasing, the slap of rope against wood, the soft thud of hooves on earth. The boundaries between captor and captive blurred, replaced by the mutual respect born of shared sweat. The women still wore their tattered uniforms. But they carried themselves differently now. They no longer moved like shadows, they strode with purpose. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Aiko dismounted from her horse and caught her reflection in the metal trough beside the barn. The woman who stared back was sunburned, her hair wind-tangled, her hands scarred, but her eyes were steady. She no longer saw a prisoner. She saw someone tempered by labor, reshaped by endurance around her. The cowboys were finishing for the day, their laughter drifting lazily through the air. She caught fragments of words, tones she didn't need translated. Amusement, approval, something like pride. That night as she lay on her bunk, her body sore but her heart strangely light, Aiko realized that what had begun as survival had become transformation. The ranch was still surrounded by barbed wire, the war still far from over. But inside those fences she had discovered something that no army could take from her. Mastery, dignity, and a sense of belonging that defied reason. And when she closed her eyes she thought not of fear but of the mayor's heartbeat beneath her hands, the steady rhythm of life that had taught her at last that strength could grow quietly like a seed in foreign soil. The next afternoon began with heat so heavy it pressed on the land like a hand. The sky was a pale burning gray, the air thick with the scent of dust and rain that had not yet fallen. Even the horses grew restless, stamping and snorting as if they could feel something stirring in the distance. The women were in the yard stacking hay when Walt looked up from his work. Far to the west, a dark bruise of cloud was spreading across the horizon. "Storm's coming," he said to no one in particular. The words carried a weight that made everyone pause. By the time the first gust of wind hit, the ranch had changed. The air grew electric, alive with the low growl of thunder. Dust spun through the air, stinging their eyes. The women rushed to secure tools and cover feed, their movements quick and practiced now, learned from months of labor beside the cowboys. But nature had no regard for discipline. Within minutes the wind howled through the fences, rattling the corral, and then the sky split open. Rain came down in sheets, turning the hard earth into slick mud. Lightning flashed white and violent, and in its brief glare the women saw the fence at the far end of the field give way. A section of barbed wire snapped, and the cattle, startled by the noise and the sudden freedom, bolted into the open prairie. Walt swore under his breath and grabbed his rope. "Let's go," he shouted. But before he could give orders the women were already moving. Eiko didn't think, she just ran. The wind tore at her hair, rain stung her face, and her boots slipped on the muddy ground, but she pushed forward. Around her the other women did the same, chasing the panicked animals through the storm. The cowboys were shouting, but the words were lost in the roar of thunder. They worked side by side, men and women, captors and captives, their shapes blurred by rain and motion. One of the horses reared terrified, and Aiko instinctively grabbed its reins. Walt saw her and moved toward her, ready to take control, but she was already calming the animal, her voice low and steady. He stopped in his tracks, watching. For the first time he didn't see prisoners, he saw partners. The women didn't wait for orders, didn't shrink from danger. They worked as if the ranch itself belonged to them, their movements fearless, purposeful. Aiko's hair clung to her face, her uniform soaked through, but she didn't falter. Together they drove the cattle back toward the fence line, forming a moving wall of determination. When one of the smaller cows slipped in the mud, she and Walt lunged at the same time to steady it. Their hands brushed, and in that instant, lightning illuminated the field. A brief blinding flash that froze them both in the storm's white breath. Neither spoke. There was no need. The world around them was chaos, wind, rain, hooves pounding the earth, but between them there was something steady, wordless, and unbreakable. Hours seemed to pass in the span of minutes. The fence was half down, the corral flooded, but the herd was safe. The storm began to ease, the thunder fading into distant rumbles. The rain softened, falling now like forgiveness. The women stood drenched, mud streaking their faces, chests heaving with exhaustion. Walt looked around at them, all of them, and felt something in his chest shift. These were no longer the frightened prisoners who had arrived months ago, clutching at one another for courage. They had become something else. Workers, fighters, survivors. Aiko met his eyes through the rain. She didn't bow and he didn't nod. They simply stood there, two people breathing the same wet air, united by effort, by danger, by something beyond language. Around them the other cowboys were laughing now, half from relief, half from disbelief. One of them clapped a woman on the shoulder, saying something that made her smile despite the mud in her hair. The boundary between them, drawn once so sharply by war, had blurred into nothing. When the storm finally broke apart and the sky began to clear, the prairie shimmered under a soft silver light. The fences were bent, the ground scarred, but the herd grazed calmly again as if nothing had happened. Walt exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "We did it," he murmured. Aiko didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She smiled faintly, her eyes bright beneath the dripping strands of her hair. That night when the campfire crackled and steam rose from drying clothes, the women sat among the cowboys without hesitation. No one spoke of captives or guards anymore. They were simply people who had weathered a storm together. For the first time since their arrival, Aiko felt truly free, not because the fences had vanished, but because they no longer mattered. The prairie had tested them and they had endured, and in the echo of thunder still rolling faintly across the hills, she felt it, the fragile, eternal truth of survival shared. By nightfall the storm had passed, leaving behind a hush so deep it seemed the earth itself was catching its breath. The prairie glistened under the fading light, every blade of grass jeweled with rain. The fences leaned but held, and the cattle grazed quietly, their low murmurs soft as prayers. Smoke rose from the campfire near the barracks, curling into the vast, unending sky. The women sat close together at first, still damp, their blankets wrapped tightly around their shoulders. Across the flames, the cowboys gathered, two boots muddy, shirts clinging to their backs, exhaustion etched deep into their faces. But there was laughter now, low and genuine.